Hello. In the previous video we talked about the rise of Greek society in the period between about 800 and about 500 BC. As we saw, this is the period that sees Greek society begin to develop its distinctive shape, its distinctive characteristics. As I stressed, this is the result of two parallel developments. On one hand, what you've got is something which looks like a military revolution taking place around about the time of Homer, around about 800 BC. We talked about the development of the hoplite and his distinctive style of fighting in the phalanx. But on the other hand, we see the development of a new political arrangement round about this time as well, and that is the polis. As I suggested, these developments are parallel because both of them embody some of the same sorts of ideals. In both, what you've got are men, and as we saw, we're talking about men, working together for a common purpose. The success of the phalanx depends upon cooperation between all individual members. And likewise, the success of a polis hinges upon the engagement of all members too. And the result in both cases is an entity that is much greater than the sum of its parts. And we concluded our discussion by talking about the development of two very different types of polises, the polis of Athens and the polis of Sparta. Sparta develops into a military state, as we saw. Athens, though, develops into a radical democracy. But as we'll see in this video, the very success of the Greek world by the end of the 6th century BC brings it headlong into conflict with the major superpower of the ancient world. This is the vast Persian Empire. And between 499 and 479 BC, the Greek world fights a titanic struggle against the Persians. To the Greeks, this was more than just a war. It was a clash of civilizations. When they'd later come to write about this war, they'd portray it as a struggle between liberty and tyranny. But what's so important about these wars with the Persians is the threat is so enormous that the Greek policies actually have to cooperate. If the policies were left individually to fight on their own against the mighty Persian Empire, they'd be swallowed up one by one. So as a result of this, what we have is something which looks like a united Greek response to the Persian threat. What Homer had fancifully described as happening during the Trojan War, back there in the 1200s BC, actually takes place here in the context of the Persian Wars in the 5th century BC. What results from the Persian Wars is a tremendous victory for the Greeks. It was united in a way that had never been united before. But the Persian War also served to sow the seeds of a second war that would pit Sparta and Athens against each other. And it was this war that led ultimately to the destruction of classical Athens. Well, so how did all of this come about? Well, if we look at this map, we can blame it to some extent on geography. The thing about the geography of Greece is that it's actually quite difficult terrain. As we've seen, much of the interior is mountainous. There's not much good arable land. And we talked as well about the rise in population that seems to take place around about 800 BC. What this means is it puts a lot of pressure on the resources of the polis. How are the polises going to feed everyone within their walls? Well, the bottom line is, of course, they can't. So to ease population pressure, the various policies in the Greek world begin to send out settlers to found new colonies. Now, don't think about these colonies in the 19th century sense of the terms. These are not colonies in the sense that Canada was a colony of Britain. The arrangement in the Greek world is much looser than that. Once a region was settled by colonists, the colony would normally be effectively independent as a political unit. It would retain some sentimental ties with its home city, with its mother city, but that's about it. In reality, these colonies were a good way for the polis to get rid of surplus population. They could get rid of all those people they couldn't feed. Equally, they could get rid of political troublemakers too. Between the middle of the 8th century BC and the age of Solon at the end of the 6th century BC, Greek policies founded more than 400 of these colonies. And as you can see from this map, Greek policies can be found on the islands of the Aegean, in Asia Minor, around the Black Sea coast, even into parts of North Africa. To the west, there are colonies in Sicily, in parts of what is now southern France as well, even as far as modern Spain. In fact, by the time of Solon, more Greeks lived in these colonies than lived in the Greek peninsula itself. But again, I must stress that these colonies were more or less independent of their mother polis. The mother polis has more or less no direct control over what the colonies do. These settlers in the colonies instead, they chart their own course. And that's the problem. That's what sets the Greek world on the collision course with the Persian Empire. In the 5th century BC, the Persian Empire is the largest empire in the world. There had never been an empire as large or as powerful. As this map so clearly shows, the Persian Empire covers an enormous stretch of the Earth's territory. The homeland of the Persians, of course, is in modern Iran, but their empire stretches to Afghanistan and Pakistan in the east, to Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor in the west. What's also remarkable about this enormous empire is that by the time the Greeks encountered it, it was actually a reasonably new creation. It was created in the middle of the 6th century BC under the leader of King Cyrus II, King Cyrus the Great. When Cyrus came to power, Persia was just a small kingdom in lower Mesopotamia. But under Cyrus and then his successor, Darius I, the Persians made a series of remarkable conquests. Under Darius, the empire even came to reach as far as Anatolia, and they even began to conquer a few Greek islands. This is a relief carved in limestone that dates from Emperor Darius's day, and it shows the emperor. He's seated on his throne here, receiving tribute and being honoured. The relief is part of a decoration in a grand chamber that Darius had built in the city of Persepolis. That's the capital of the Persian Empire. Darius didn't live to see the chamber completed. It was actually finished by his son, Xerxes I, and we'll meet Xerxes shortly. He's actually the person standing in relief immediately behind the emperor. And note that Darius and Xerxes are taller than all of the other figures in this relief. And if Darius was to stand up in this relief, he'd actually probably be taller than Xerxes. So the relief helps underscore the importance of both Darius and Xerxes to anyone who happened to see it. Many of our non-Greek sources tell us that wherever the Persians went, they were greeted quite favourably. If you know the story of the Babylonian captivity of the Jews from the Old Testament, it was King Cyrus who conquers Babylon and lets the Jews return home. So he turns out all right in the pages of the Old Testament. And in general, the Persians were not so bad as conquerors go. They wanted to make sure they got some tribute from each of the places they conquer. Absolutely, that's par for the course, you can expect it. But they also showed themselves quite prepared to work with the local political institutions they encountered, working with people who were already in power, working through all of the political structures that were already in place. That was easier than imposing things from the outside on these conquered people. So when the Persians encountered the Greek colonies in Anatolia, they simply appointed prominent Greeks to rule them, and they received the tribute from them. Of course, in the West, we tend to read largely the accounts about the Persians that emanated from the Greek world. And in these works, the Persians are depicted very differently. They're depicted as evil, tyrannical despots. That's wholly undeserved. Some of these Greek policies actually don't mind the Persians getting involved in the politics of Anatolia. Remember, these policies are all fiercely rivals. What these policies think is perhaps maybe they can get the Persians to do some of their dirty work for them. Get the Persians thinking that a rival polis is actually an enemy of the Persians too. Then of course the Persians are going to send in the army, they're going to swoop down, they're going to destroy your rival. It's sort of like telling the school bully that you're going to get your big brother to beat him up. Well, that's all well and good in theory. In practice, of course, it's a knife-edged act. Perhaps your big brother doesn't actually want to beat up the bully. Perhaps your big brother actually ends up getting beaten up by the bully himself. And if that happens, where does it leave you? That's more or less exactly what happened. In the year 499, the ambitious ruler of the polis of Miletus, a man named Aristagoras, urged the Persians to destroy their rivals on the island of Naxos. Miletus is here in Asia Minor. The Persians think that this is a good idea, and so they send an expedition off to Naxos, but things don't go quite as planned, because Naxos does not fall to the Persians. This puts Aristagoras in a very difficult situation. He'd pressed for the invasion, and it had failed. If heads were going to roll, his would surely be the first on the chopping block. In these circumstances, Aristagoras decided to gamble. He decided to organize a rebellion of all of the policies in Asia Minor against the Persians, and it would be led by him and Miletus. But he realizes if he's going to take on the strongest empire of the day, he needs some support from the mainland. He needs some of the major policies of the Greek world to come on side and help. So he sends messengers back to Greece. First stop, Sparta. Sparta, of course, is the most powerful of the Greek policies, and we saw why last time round. So stopping at Sparta, asking for help there, that makes sense. But the Spartans aren't having any of it. They're not particularly interested in helping. In part, the Spartans are afraid of sending so many of their hoplites away, because if they sent so many of their hoplites away, it would leave their homeland undefended against their Helot population. So the Spartans say, no thanks, we're not getting involved. So then Aristagoras sends his messengers off to Athens. Athens is his second choice. And the Athenian assembly meets, and they vote to send a fleet of 20 ships to help Miletus and the rebels. And in 498, the Athenian fleet attacks the Persians in the city of Sardis in Asia Minor. This was the Persian centre of power in the region. It's where the Persian governor lived. The Athenian fleet attacks the city and sets it on fire. The Persian governor is forced to run away. This is a great victory. The Persians in Anatolia had been humiliated. And so other policies in the region thought Miletus was onto something, and they rejoined the Milesian rebellion. Persian power was on the wane, they felt. Grab what you can while the going's good. As far as the Athenians were concerned, job done. It was pretty much over. They're not interested in helping anymore. And so they bring their fleet home. Of course, the Persians aren't going to take this lying down. Over the next 4 years, the Persians slowly advanced again into Anatolia, taking back the region polis by polis. In 494 BC, they finally reached Miletus, and they burned it to the ground. They slaughtered most of the men, they enslaved the rest, along with the wives and the children. And with that, the rebellion was over. Well, it was over, except for the revenge. As far as Darius was concerned, the Athenians had absolutely no business intervening in Anatolia. And as far as Darius was concerned, it was time to teach this upstart little Athenian polis what real power was all about. And so in 491 BC, he sends messengers to Athens and all of the other policies in the peninsula and demands their complete surrender. In fact, he sends messengers to Sparta as well. As we've seen, Sparta had nothing to do with this. They wanted nothing to do with the Milesian rebellion. At this, Athens and Sparta decide they need to put aside their rivalries. So Sparta offered to make an alliance with Athens. And to make it clear that they were serious, they decided to execute Darius's messengers. Because once you've done that, there's no going back. The alliance between Sparta and Athens was written literally in blood. But this alliance is important because we've got all the Greek world facing against the Persians. This really will be the kind of all-Greek struggle that Homer had been trying to paint in the Iliad so many years before. In 490 BC, the Persians attacked. They land an enormous invasion force just north of Athens at a place called Marathon. The Athenians quickly assembled an army of hoplites and attacked. And amazingly, they routed the Persians. The Greeks claimed that they'd killed 6,400 Persians for the loss of just 192 of their own men. Now, you've got to take that sort of accounting in the ancient world with a grain of salt. What they're really saying is that we killed an awful lot of Persians and they didn't kill very many of our people. These numbers maybe give you a sense of the order of magnitude, but they are not reliable at all. The Greeks play up their victory at the Battle of Marathon to the hilt. This battle became the stuff of heady legend. Plucky little Athens had defeated the mighty Persian Empire all by itself. You can see the Athenians quaffing back the wine by the amphora and telling this story, and in each telling the story gets bigger and bigger. Legends develop. Legends develop that after the battle an Athenian soldier ran 25 miles from Marathon back to the city of Athens to report the wonderful news about this victory. This is the inspiration, of course, for the modern marathon race. Unfortunately, the story, as it's told, is just that. It's a story. There seems to be no historical basis for this account at all. In fact, we don't have that story of the runner until the 1st century AD. So 600 years after the fact. So it's probably apocryphal. But what legends like this do show is that to the Athenians, Marathon was a big, big deal. To the vast Persian Empire, though, it was little more than a minor setback. Upon hearing the news of the Persian defeat, Darius decides to launch another invasion, and to do so as soon as possible. Unfortunately, politics got involved and he got distracted elsewhere in his empire, and so when he died just a couple of years later, his preparations weren't quite complete. It was left to his son, Xerxes, to mete out the revenge. In 480 BC, Xerxes had finished assembling his invasion force. He has an army of 150,000 troops, we're told, and a fleet of over 1,000 ships. He was going to thrash these pesky Greeks once and for all. The Persians landed at Athens and they torched the place. For their part, though, the Athenians were not looking for another battle of Marathon. They knew they'd been lucky first time round, and now they were facing a much, much bigger Persian army. They thought that their best chance of dealing with the Persians would be at sea. So, with Athens aflame, what the Athenians did was take to the seas and they launched a naval attack against the Persian fleet. And they were successful. They destroyed the Persian fleet. At this, Xerxes himself decided to go home. He left one of his best generals in Greece to take care of the situation. But at this point, Sparta takes the lead in military affairs. The final showdown takes place in August 479 BC. A coalition of Greek forces led by Sparta meets a much larger Persian army at the Battle of Plataea. This is the battlefield itself as it looks today. You can imagine the two sides arrayed on this territory. It's hard to get anything close to a reliable estimate of the size of the forces involved. But on the Greek side, there were probably no more than about 70,000 soldiers. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, who we'll meet in the very next video, the Persians numbered perhaps as many as 300,000. And they were supported by some of the Greek policies that had defected to the Persian cause. Despite the numbers, the result was a conclusive Greek victory. Herodotus says that 257 Persians were slain. That's likely a huge exaggeration, and as I said, you've got to take these numbers in the ancient world with a huge grain of salt. But he does give us a very interesting scene at the end of his account of the battle. After all the fighting was over, he says that the Spartan commander came into the tent of the Persian general. The tent is covered in elaborate embroideries, lots of gold, lots of silver decorations, very, very ornate affair. And the Spartan commander orders that the Persian cooks prepare the kind of meal that their general would have eaten that night had he won the battle. The result is an enormous, elaborate feast. The Spartan commander, Herodotus says, can't believe his eyes. So he orders one of his own cooks to cook an ordinary Spartan dinner and to set it beside the Persian feast. Remember, the Spartans prized their simplicity, their frugality. And then the Spartan commander brings in all of the other Greek generals to compare the two meals. And according to Herodotus, the Spartan general says this: "Men of Greece, I ask you here to show you the folly of the Persians. They live in this style, and yet they came to Greece to rob us of our poverty." Already, here, we're on the verge of myth-making. Here we have the vast Persian Empire, with all of its wealth, all of its luxury, being beaten back by a small, poor band of Greeks. Plautius saw off the Persians. They didn't come back after this. But the legacy of these wars resounds through the Greek world for the next century and a half. In many ways, though, as we'll see in the next video, modern Western society still operates in the shadow of the Persian wars from the end of the 5th century BC.